Greetings to all of the participants in this very important conference. I think there is no more important activity for us than the pursuit of peace. As we speak, we know that Ukraine is suffering, and tens or hundreds of thousands of people will die in the coming weeks and months if the war continues on its current trajectory. Indeed, the whole world is at threat because this war could escalate to a nuclear war between the United States and Russia. Have no doubt that we are on a continuing path of escalation. Peace through negotiation is not only possible, but it was nearly achieved, though, alas, our mainstream media in the US and Europe don't report basic facts anymore. Peace through negotiation was almost achieved in March 2022, just after Russia's invasion. Because in March 2022, the Ukrainian government and the Russian government exchanged documents and negotiated an agreement with the mediation of the government of Turkey and the informal mediation of then Prime Minister Naftali Bennett of Israel. This agreement was nearly reached and signed, and though you cannot find it in the press, the United States stopped the negotiations. It's very important to understand that. It's very hard to understand that through the wall of falsehoods and the wall of deception that surrounds this whole war in the West. The United States has not wanted a negotiated end to the war. And if we return from March 2022 to 3 months earlier, a negotiated settlement before the war was absolutely possible, again, not reported in our media. On December 17, 2021, President Vladimir Putin put on the table a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement. At the core of that agreement was that NATO would not enlarge to Ukraine and to the 2,000-kilometer border of Russia. This was not only a concession that the United States should have made to avoid war. It was in America's interest, in Ukraine's interest, in Russia's interest, and in the world's interest. The idea that the United States should push its military alliance, its weapon systems, its bases up to the Russian border is mind-boggling in its recklessness. President Putin put a proposal on the table. I called the White House soon afterwards and beseeched the White House to negotiate on that basis. I explained to the White House how would the United States feel if Russia had bases in Mexico or China had bases in Mexico. The last time that was tried, the United States invaded the said country, which was Cuba, 60 years ago. The White House told me the U.S. will not negotiate with Russia over the enlargement of NATO. I said there will be war if there is not proper diplomacy. The White House did not want to avoid this war through diplomacy. It either thought that it could call the bluff of President Putin or have the war and accomplish what our defense secretary, better to say our war secretary, Lloyd Austin, publicly stated, and that is that the goal of this war is to weaken Russia. If the Ukrainians die and if Ukraine is destroyed in the middle, that's what a proxy war is. All my life, 68 years, I have witnessed U.S. proxy wars in Vietnam, in Laos, in Cambodia, in Nicaragua, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Libya, and now in Ukraine. The United States is not thinking about Ukraine. It's thinking about weakening its adversary, or its perceived adversary, Russia. So diplomacy was stopped by the United States in March 2022. It was rejected by the United States in December 2021, and it was rejected by the United States between 2014 and 2021, because when the Minsk I agreement and Minsk II agreements were signed, the United States supported the government of Ukraine to not honor the agreement that Ukraine had signed. The purpose of the Minsk II agreements was to ensure the language and cultural rights of the people of the Donbass, or eastern Ukraine, overwhelmingly Russian ethnicity, with a system of autonomy, which the government of Ukraine agreed to, and in which France and Germany were to be the guarantors, and in which the entire UN Security Council unanimously backed. And the Ukraine government said, no, we don't want to implement what we have signed. The United States said, fine, we will send you arms. You don't have to implement that, even though the UN Security Council had signed. So, in fact, the rejection of diplomacy goes back to late 2014 and early 2015. But in fact, the US rejection of diplomacy goes back even further. It goes back to February 2014, because in February 2014, again, never explored in our mainstream media, but obvious to anybody paying attention, the United States conspired to overthrow the government of Viktor Yanukovych, who was pursuing the path of neutrality in Ukraine. And if that sounds shocking, please go back and listen to the conversation between the then Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, and the then U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piat, which took place 3 weeks before the violent overthrow of the Yanukovych regime. In that call, Victoria Nuland described who would be the post-Yanukovych government. Again, I'm 68 years old. I have lived through dozens of U.S. regime change operations all over the world. I've seen some with my own eyes. And this one I saw very close up. And of course, there was a violent insurrection 3 weeks after the intercepted call, and the government that was brought into place was exactly the one that Victoria Nuland, as Assistant Secretary of State, had described on the call to the U.S. ambassador. I was in Kiev soon afterwards. I learned firsthand how U.S. funding from so-called NGOs had paid for a lot of the so-called Maidan revolution. This was the trigger of the war that really started 9 years ago. Again, it was a rejection of diplomacy by the United States because the sitting president of Ukraine wanted neutrality, whereas the US government wanted NATO enlargement. That means that this conflict actually dates back even earlier to 2008. We can go, because in 2008, George Bush put on the table that NATO would enlarge to Ukraine and to Georgia. If you look at a map, the US plan is absolutely clear and follows a line that had been spelled out a decade earlier by Zbigniew Brzezinski, the national security advisor to Carter and one of the leading US geostrategists. The idea was to encircle Russia in the Black Sea region, because with Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO, Russia would be encircled by Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia in the Black Sea. The idea, clearly stated, was to bottle up Russia so that Russia was no longer any problem to U.S. policy. Where did the U.S. want a free hand? It wanted to be able to replace governments at will in the Middle East. For example, overthrowing Saddam Hussein in 2003, overthrowing Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, a NATO exercise, by the way, not just a U.S. exercise, but a NATO exercise, overthrowing Bashar al-Assad in 2011. This is another point that's misunderstood. Bashar al-Assad and the so-called Syrian civil war is a U.S. regime change operation gone terribly wrong. The idea was that the CIA would work with the regional governments to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. It failed. Several years later, Russia came to the assistance of its ally, and then our media pointed the finger at Russian intervention, ignoring the U.S. intervention beforehand. There has been almost no reporting about the basic fact of Operation Timber Sycamore, which was an order by President Obama that the CIA would overthrow Bashar al-Assad. I know a lot of this also directly from people who were absolutely involved and trying to stop the war, but the United States opposed diplomacy. We can keep winding the clock back to truly understand what this is about. The U.S. at every stage has rejected diplomacy, and it goes back to actually 1990. In 1990, incidentally, I was an economic advisor to President Mikhail Gorbachev's economic team. Gorbachev wanted peace in Europe. He wanted a common European home. At that time, the United States and Germany promised explicitly that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. That was a lie and a phony promise. Gorbachev disbanded the Soviet-led military alliance, Germany reunified, and by 1992, the United States was already planning the massive expansion of NATO all the way to Ukraine. Historians are finding in the archives that the plan to expand NATO all the way to Ukraine dates back to 1992. Incidentally, Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote in 1997 in Foreign Affairs a very clear article that lays out the explicit timeline for NATO enlargement, saying that between 2005 and 2010, Ukraine would join NATO. And of course, the invitation pushed by the United States came in 2008, just on Brzezinski's timeline. And note, this is well before Putin. This is well before any supposed threats coming from Russia. This was U.S. military expansion planned for 3 decades now, and nothing is to stop it. Not diplomacy, not negotiation, not avoidance of war, not any truth-telling in the newspapers. And while the Standard may call this a propaganda event, I would welcome a public discussion with the editor of the Standard at any moment to discuss these issues. Because these are facts. This is the history. This is not what's reported in our mainstream media now. Our mainstream media makes a false narrative that this war started with a, quote, unprovoked invasion on February 24th, 2022 by Putin. That is the official Western narrative. The New York Times has repeated that claim 26 times in its editorials and its op-eds, but it never allows anyone to tell the real history in the pages to the readership. And this is what's happening all over the US and all over Europe. We're talking to ourselves. We are leading to the destruction of Ukraine because there is no way in the world to have a military victory over Russia with NATO enlargement as the end result, because Russia will continue to escalate as needed. Perhaps Russia will simply defeat Ukraine on the battlefield. That is quite possible. But if not, Russia will escalate. And Russia has 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons. President Obama, though he contributed to this overthrow of Yanukovych, was also very clear in 2014, do not get into a war over this issue, because as he put it then, Russia has escalatory dominance, meaning they can always raise the stakes up to and including nuclear war. We are on a reckless path based on falsehoods. This war could have been avoided at countless stages in the last 30 years. This war should never have broken out 9 years ago, because the United States should never be part of violent overthrows of other governments, but it's a bad habit of the United States. Europe should have enforced the Minsk II agreements, backed by the UN Security Council, signed by Ukraine, instead of ignoring them, laughing at them. But the United States said, no, you don't have to follow those. We will arm you. The United States should have negotiated at the end of 2021. The United States should have applauded rather than stopped the negotiations in March 2022. So till today, there is a negotiating path that has been on the table. At the core is neutrality of Ukraine to keep the two nuclear superpowers away from each other. It's common sense. It is what the United States has demanded for 2 centuries in the Western Hemisphere. If the U.S. neoconservatives were not so arrogant, reckless, and blind, it would have been agreed a long time ago. Till this moment, it is possible. NATO, however, which is a U.S. military alliance, insists that no third country, that is Russia or anybody else, has any right to have any say to where the U.S. military alliance goes. That is reckless, and it leads to war. And now have no doubt about the U.S. irresponsibility, which is trying to place NATO offices in Asia. I think not even remembering that it's not the North Asia Treaty Organization, it is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It is not an expeditionary force for U.S. hegemony. It was meant to defend Western Europe against the Soviet Union, which no longer exists. And yet the United States is trying to expand NATO now to Asia to fight China. Europeans are aghast, but the media are not explaining what this is about. And they are certainly not telling the truth that the war in Ukraine is a disaster that came from the unrelenting arrogance of the United States to keep pushing, provoking, and to avoiding every possibility of a diplomatic off-ramp. So let us help people to understand that negotiations till this moment are feasible, and that President Biden needs to step forward and say NATO will stop its enlargement if Russia leaves and ends the fighting. And this will be the basis for peace. Let me close by noting that today exactly is the 60th anniversary of the greatest speech by any U.S. president on peace, John F. Kennedy's peace speech, given June 10, 1963, at the height of the Cold War. And what President Kennedy said is precisely relevant to us today. At the height of the Cold War, he had the clarity, the honesty, the eloquence, and the leadership to say that the Soviet Union did not want war, the United States does not want war, we can negotiate peace. And President Kennedy called on Americans to reconsider their attitudes to the Cold War and to the Soviet Union. President Kennedy said we should hail the Russian people for their vast achievements in science and industry and culture. At the height of the Cold War, he dared to say this. He knew that the military-industrial complex opposed him. He knew the generals resented a peace initiative, but the American people overwhelmingly supported it. And 5 weeks after President Kennedy's brilliant speech, which everybody can listen to online, Kennedy and Khrushchev signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And President Kennedy made a campaign in the United States over the heads of the military-industrial complex to speak directly to the American people that peace is possible, that the U.S. and the Soviet Union have a mutual interest in peace, that an agreement on peace will be in the interest of both sides and enforced by both sides. And President Kennedy carried the day when the Senate voted 80-19 to ratify the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. That is leadership. That is an expression of the true common good. That is what is possible today. Thank you very much. Well, it's like the United States. What is democracy right now? It's a game of narratives and propaganda. So I think it's a shame. It's very sad what's happening right now. And the result is war in Ukraine, in which tens of thousands of people are being killed actually every month now. And this is going on because the U.S. security state insists on it. And we know that just about every politician in Western Europe feels that you can't cross the United States because European security depends on it. There's been almost a complete elimination of the line between the European Union, which is a political and economic construction, and NATO. And it's not an accident that the headquarters of both NATO and the EU are in Brussels. I think it's a sad fact that Europe lost its way by confusing this military alliance, which is a US-led construction, with the political, cultural, social, and economic grouping of Europe, which is an aim to get the best of more than 2,000 years of culture in Europe. But now they're all confused. And I know that the European leaders simply will not cross the White House. Truly, I don't understand why, because none of this is in Europe's real interest. And many European leaders know better, but they're not talking. And what's happening in the media in Slovakia is happening all over the regions dominated by the U.S. And people are afraid. People are afraid of the United States government. People are afraid of the security state. People say, well, that's where our bread is buttered, or that's where our incomes come from, or that is where our security comes from. So we're not going to cross that. And it's terrible, because if people would understand recent history, what is this U.S. security state? It's the one that brought 20 years of destruction to Afghanistan. It's the one that brought the Iraq War. It's the one that destabilized Syria. It's the one that destabilized Libya. And it's the one that destabilized Ukraine, by the way. So people should see it with their own eyes. It's too bad. I want my country to do better, but I would have expected other countries to look at the facts as they are.
How do you think the conflict in Ukraine is developing, and how will it end?
Well, I think Ukraine is getting destroyed. I said at the beginning of this that the United States was going to turn Ukraine into Europe's Afghanistan. What did I mean by that? The United States went into Afghanistan in 1979. President Carter ordered the CIA to start funding the jihadists to try to overthrow the Afghan government. That was 44 years ago. And look at the result. The U.S. turned Afghanistan into a 40-year battlefield. And then one day it just left, because that's also the U.S. way. Same happened in Vietnam and in many other places. The whole thing with the U.S. is plenty of weapons, but as long as the U.S. isn't fighting there, they're content to keep sending weapons and keep having bloodshed. What's sad is that the Ukrainians are, for some reason, party to this. The Ukrainian leadership, we don't know what the Ukrainian people feel, because it's martial law, there's no elections, there's no asking. Now Zelensky said mobilization of every male in the society. Are they really going to just continue to throw away the lives of tens or hundreds of thousands of people for NATO enlargement? I don't know.
The American think tank Rand Corporation released a report on the post-war reconstruction of Ukraine. The United States and several Western European companies want to participate very actively in the restoration of Ukraine. You worked in Ukraine in the 1990s. You were an advisor during several transformations in Eastern European economies. How do you think is it possible to prevent this recovery from ending with the sale of Ukrainian companies?
No one is going to rescue Ukraine, believe me. There's going to be no Marshall Plan for Ukraine. There's going to be no hundreds of billions of dollars for Ukraine. This is all fantasy world, period.
And my last question, Mr. Professor, what is your explanation for the fact overall the sanctions did not put the Russian economy on hold? The war and sanctions are growing by less than 2%. According to the World Bank, Russia's economy is now the strongest in Europe and the fifth largest in the world. How is it possible?
Because most of the world does not agree with the U.S. and European Union. Shockingly, the Americans and the Europeans don't understand this because our media don't tell the truth. But my job is to work all over the world, mainly in the developing countries, in Africa, in Latin America, in South Asia, in East Asia, in Central Asia. Nobody believes in the official story that this is unprovoked Russian aggression against Ukraine. Everybody knows this is about the U.S. and Russia, NATO enlargement, U.S. power. This is what people know. So governments around the world didn't stop doing business with Russia. That's it. If they had, the sanctions would have had a much bigger effect. But Russia's actively trading all over Asia, all over Latin America, all over Africa. And the sanctions regime is just the US, EU, UK, Japan, Korea, Singapore. That's it. And the rest of the world is doing its business. And our media can't understand this because their job is to report the US government narrative, which is that the whole world is united against Russia. Well, nonsense. This is exactly why these sanctions didn't work. By the way, the sanctions didn't work for a simple reason, which is not only does most of the world want to continue to have normal economic relations with Russia, but it's not so hard to have arrangements that don't involve U.S. banks. You just use other people's banks. That's the story. And so settling in rubles or settling in renminbi or settling in some other currency is not rocket science. It's just if you're not a friend of the United States, keep your money out of U.S. dollars because they may take the money away. That's the lesson. And so Russia's now dealing in non-dollar transactions.
For last 3 years, you are being consulted because of the COVID, because of the Ukraine war, etc. But predominantly you are an economist, yes? So we would like to take advantage of your economist knowledge. And you quite often mention that there's the de-dollarization threat, that it's clear that the de-dollarization will happen. So the question is, especially in the terms of huge United States inner debt, what will be the causes of de-dollarization for the United States, and what are the causes of de-dollarization for the Western economics which are closely joined, which really depend on the United States economy?
I think there are two different issues for people to understand. One is the so-called real economy, what different parts of the world produce, the technologies that they have, the trade in goods and services, the innovations. And the second is the financial side, how transactions are made, in which currency, in which institutions, banks, or through the internet, and so forth. And the point that I'm making broadly is that on the second dimension, the role of the dollar will diminish over time for two main reasons. One is that it's not safe for any country that is not in good foreign relations with the United States to keep its reserves in dollars, because the U.S. has basically militarized the dollar. If you're an enemy of the United States, the U.S. will confiscate your foreign exchange reserves in Venezuela, in Iran, in Afghanistan, in Russia. So the United States didn't say, oh, we protect the property rights. We may have disagreements, but we protect the property. Quite the contrary. The United States said, we're freezing all of Russia's financial assets. And not just that, quite interestingly, if you're a friend of Putin, whatever that means, I don't know what that means in a court of law, but we're going to take your apartments, we'll take your financial assets, we'll freeze your bank accounts. It's really amazing to me because the United States is supposed to be the place that protects property rights. So the first thing is that lots of governments, especially the governments not friendly with the United States, are trying to find a different way to settle transactions, and they're smart to do so. The second thing that's happening is that the normal way in general of settling transactions, which is through banks, is going to diminish because of digital currencies, because of the ability to have central bank digital currencies. I think this will make a big difference. It's only at the beginning, so it's a little bit hard to say the timing, but I do believe that there will be direct settlements using basically central bank direct settlement mechanisms rather than going through commercial banks, which is much more laborious. But we went through banks for hundreds of years because that was the only alternative. Now with the internet and with all of the paraphernalia around digital finance, we can do it in a much more efficient way.
Well, if the demilitarization of dollar happened under different administrative, under different president, do you think that that dollarization can slow down, the dollar can remain the first class currency for other tens or hundreds of years?
Not for hundreds of years, certainly, but there is normally a very gradual change in settlements processes because of network externalities, so-called, which means people use dollars because other people use dollars. So the dollar has a certain staying power. The U.S. is wrecking it by its foreign policy right now. It's shocking to me how they're taking measures that are directly wounding the role of the dollar, because I wouldn't have done at all what the U.S. government has done in freezing assets and seizing assets and so forth. But still, the dollar remains because there's a lot of infrastructure. There is the big network. There is a lot of financial expertise. But the U.S. is also, over time, declining as a share of the world economy. The sterling, the pound sterling, was the dollar of the 19th century. It was unthinkable that there would be anything other than the pound sterling. Now, what's the pound sterling? It's a footnote in history. It's still used in Britain, but who cares? It plays basically no role in the international system. And someday that will be the situation with the U.S. dollar, because the U.S. is only 4% of the world population. So it can't really be the center of the world the way that American strategists want it to be and believe it to be. But the dollar could remain for quite a while, not on our current policy though.
Well, let's discuss the BRIC, because BRIC, and it's nearly forgotten right now, was created as the toy, as the mental toy of Western academics. First of all, it used to be just an acronym in 2001. But now it's emancipated, it's strong, it seems to be the new economic integration, and there are some discussions about the enlargement of that. So first of all, do you think that Western academics really intend to create this very self-confidence integration? And secondly, do you think that it can be really enlarged unless it was harmed by the enlargement?
originally the BRICS was the idea that, boy, there's a lot of good places to invest in a diversified portfolio because you have these emerging economies and they're growing, they're adopting technologies. So it was a Goldman Sachs invention, not a Jeffrey Sachs invention, but the bank Goldman Sachs. It was basically a reflection of the emergence of the emerging markets. But then it became political. The BRICS started to meet with each other, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Now, why? Because they had one major thing in common other than being emerging economies, and that was they didn't want the U.S. as the hegemonic power. It was really annoying for all of them to have the United States say, we're the world leader, we're the sole superpower, we're the indispensable country, we make the rules-based system. Which rules? Our rules. So that's what united the BRICS, was annoyance, actually, with the arrogance of U.S. liberal hegemonists or neocons. They made the BRICS. Actually, even it's interesting that Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a very clever strategist for the U.S. power, wrote, when he wrote The Global Chessboard in 1997, he said, the one unthinkable thing is for the U.S. to push Russia and China together. But because of American arrogance, that's exactly what America did every day, step by step, for the next 25 years. And that's what made the BRICS. And I think that's what basically unites the BRICS. On the one side, they're united because, well, they're important economies, and the BRICS are now larger than the G7 in purchasing power measured terms. So that's a big deal. But I think the other thing is geopolitical, which is the BRICS really say, we're big powers. We want a multipolar world. We don't want the U.S. surrounding us with military bases. That's the Russian view. That is the Chinese view. Brazil says, come on, don't interfere in South America the way you do, saying we're going to overthrow the Venezuelan government, which was another stupid U.S. idea of the last 10 years. And so Brazil, in a different way, because it's not a superpower like China or Russia, it's not a nuclear power, but it still says, give some space to our region. We don't want the U.S. dictating to us. China's quite interesting because China triangulates. I don't mean China, sorry, India. India is quite interesting because India really triangulates. They have their tensions, even border disputes, of course, with between India and China. And the United States says, okay, we'll be your partner. You just have to oppose China. But India is also, of course, a great civilization. It was colonized by Britain for centuries. And it's not about to say, yes, United States, you run the world. So India fits in this mold in a very interesting way as well, basically as the world's most populous country that wants to have its global say. So what the BRICS really represent is the call for multipolarity as opposed to a US-led world. Europe somehow just wanted to duck under the blanket, and have the U.S. protection, which is very surprising to me because Europe has been very naive in recent years, especially regarding Ukraine. It's accepted huge economic costs without any strategic thinking because the U.S. said so, and we'll see how that evolves.
Seen from the West or Western Europe or probably even the United States, the BRICS seems to be nowadays something as the black box. So now there's minimum of contact between the Western academic sphere and BRICS universities, minimum contact between the Ministry of Finance, central banks, etc. You've mentioned the Goldman Sachs, probably even JP Morgan and the others. Can you see some attempts of infiltration of these old Bretton Woods organizations, old banks, houses, as they wanted to infiltrate the BRICS institutions, the BRICS academic circles, because BRICS now really wants to be the number one. Yeah, so I can't imagine that Goldman Sachs wouldn't try to be in close, deep touch on this process.
Well, look, the Wall Street very much has a presence and wants an even bigger presence in China. It wants a presence in India and so on. Russia is another matter because stupidly for the moment, all economic connections were lost and cut, which is a shame. I believe they'll come back because you can't just close your eyes and say that a country of 11 time zones and a nuclear superpower doesn't exist, but that's the attitude right now. In fact, there's lots of connection. Where the breakdown is occurring is at the political level. The companies would like to have ongoing normal relations with China, but the United States is saying, no, we have to go into a containment mode. We're going to scrutinize your investments. If a U.S. company invests in China, it's considered unpatriotic or maybe threatening U.S. security. This is the change, really. And there's lots of interchange over the last 30 years between U.S. and Chinese scholars and lots of Chinese students studying in the United States and Europe, but the U.S. is cutting that too. All of this is bad for the U.S. and Europe. All of this fear, protectionism, hostility is an own goal. It's a self-imposed cost, but it comes from this U.S. idea that either we're number one or we're going to fight to stop you from being so powerful, and it's leading to a very tense breakdown of relations that existed. And that still exist to an important extent, but are now under a very dark cloud. And so if you have good relations with China, oh, the eyebrows are raised in the United States. What are you doing? Something improper, and so on. And Europe is increasingly playing with this, which is ridiculous because Europe and China are partners in Eurasia. Europe and China have every reason to cooperate with each other, to trade with each other. The Silk routes are not an imaginary idea. They go back 2,000 years, east-west trade. And but Europe is parroting, or at least Brussels is parroting the U.S. line right now. And the U.S. idea of NATO expanding to East Asia, I have to put as the number one dumbest idea that I've heard. You know, for NATO to open an office in Tokyo, for example. What are we possibly thinking? And how could Europe, which is filled with such intelligent people, ever go along with this idea? I don't know.
Probably the last question. There's a wide discussion about the BRICS currency unit, new currency unit, artificial currency unit. Is there something that the BRICS as the integration can get inspired by Europe, by special drawing rights? Probably how to avoid the mistakes and the deep errors of them. What should be the design of such unit?
I doubt that there will be a BRICS currency anytime soon, but what I do believe is that there will be a non-dollar, non-euro settlements system that the BRICS countries will use. Maybe they'll settle a lot in renminbi, maybe they'll settle in Indian rupees, they will settle some in rubles, they may establish financial institutions with extensive swap lines between the central banks, kind of a quasi-IMF that would help to ensure liquidity among the trading partners within the BRICS and a broader network. But a single currency, I doubt it. One could say, by the way, that there could be something like a BRICS SDR, which is a unit of account. It's a basket. It can serve certain purposes, but it's not really a settlements currency, and it's not really an active transactions currency. So one could imagine something like that, but I don't think we're going to see an actual currency that you can look at or hold in your account that's and use for transactions that's a BRICS currency anytime soon. Maybe I'm out of date and it's going to happen faster, but I think it'll be much more likely that, excuse me, on our phones we'll be able to settle in renminbi, or we'll be able to settle in rupees or reales, rather than a single BRICS currency. Yeah, I think it's exactly the right analogy. When did World War I start? Did it start on June 28th with the assassination of the Archduke? Did it start on July 28th with the declaration of war by Austria against Serbia? Did it start 10 years earlier when military alliances were secretly made that led to the triggering of disaster? Of course, there are roots to any conflict. And even the dating that we give to the Ukraine war in most of the Western media is simply false on its surface, but it also disguises the antecedent causes. This war started in February 2014. We say it started in February 2022, typically, that Putin, without provocation, because he's a madman and wanted to recreate the Russian Empire in his fantasies, launched an unprovoked war on February 24th, 2022. That's just propaganda. That's not even factual about when the fighting started, because the fighting started in 2014, not in 2022. And it raged, actually, between 2014 and 2022. So even the simple fact of when the war started was that it started 8 years earlier. And of course, why the war started 8 years earlier is heavily contested, but I'll give you my 5-minute view, and that is that from 1990 onward, we failed to endorse, adopt, and build on Gorbachev's vision of a common European home, and instead the U.S. set up a vision of a U.S.-led unipolar world and believed that the Cold War was won by a U.S. victory rather than achieved by a diplomatic settlement. In fact, the U.S. did not defeat the Soviet Union. Gorbachev unilaterally said we should end the Cold War. We want to reform. We're going to disband the Warsaw Pact because we don't want to address our issues through military means. And he was told in 1990, okay, if you do that, Germany wants to reunify, but we commit to not expanding our military alliance, NATO, in place of what was the Warsaw Pact. And a famous promise was made that we will not move NATO 1 inch eastward. And by the way, I always like to say in my talks, if you want documentary evidence, my email is sachs@columbia.edu, and I'll be happy to refer you to the archival material that documents this, because this is all denied now by the United States, which likes a politics of amnesia rather than a politics of memory in this case. So the U.S. promised no NATO enlargement. By 1992, the neoconservatives in the United States, which means the hawkish or war party, was in power. Remember Cheney, Wolfowitz, and Rumsfeld, and then they were followed by the Democratic Party side of the war party, which is Madeleine Albright, Richard Holbrooke, and others. So it's both parties. It's not one party or another party. They said, no, we won. It's a unipolar world. Anyway, Soviet Union's finished. We don't have any commitments to keep. And so Bill Clinton started the NATO enlargement in the mid-1990s. And really smart people knew at the time, this is reckless. This is dangerous. It's a cheat, and it's also a provocation. And so that went on for a long time. By the way, when President Putin came to power in 1999, he was not anti-European. He was not anti-American. He expected cooperation. But he said, stop the NATO enlargement because, we have interests and we don't want your military on our border. Then came 9/11. The neocons went into absolute preeminence. Cheney basically ran the security state of the United States from 2001 to 2008. He was a very dangerous person. He said if there's 1% risk of something, you have to treat it like it's 100% chance. If Saddam has 1% chance of having nuclear weapons, you have to treat it like it's certainty. That's a little crazy, by the way, in decision analysis. You don't treat a 1% as 100%, but you do create a lot of wars if you do that. So all the wars started. And the NATO enlargement continued in 2004, 7 more countries. The Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, and Slovakia. And then in 2007, Putin said, no more. So George W. Bush in 2008 said, yes, more. Ukraine and Georgia. This was not prudent. Prudentia, is a Latin word meaning practical good judgment. And it comes from a Greek word called sophrosony, which means wisdom. This is not wisdom. This is stupid. And that's what they announced in Bucharest 2008. And many European leaders said to me at the time, what is he doing? We're against this. But one thing, this is the continuing slide into this, and I'll just finish with 2 quick points on this. In 2014, the U.S. helped overthrow the president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. We know it from many means. I know it because I happen to see things that I wish I hadn't seen. But the U.S. was part of this overthrow. Putin didn't like that either, because Yanukovych was actually rather cleverly trying to balance 2 giants. On the one side, the West saying you must do this and you must do that. On the other side, Russia saying you must do this and must do that. And Yanukovych's position was, we're neutral, thank you, we're neutral. That was rather intolerable to the United States. Neutrality doesn't work in the U.S. mindset, because you're either with us or you're against us. And so they helped to overthrow him in February 2014. That's when the war started. And between 2014 and 2021, there was fighting the whole time, but the U.S. put in billions of dollars of weaponry. And the Ukrainians built fortifications along this line that we're seeing the front line. That didn't just start a few months ago. That was 8 years of fortifying the eastern Ukraine with American finance and know-how and weaponry. So at the end of 2021, after Biden had come into office, Putin said, look, you crossed every red line, but our red line is NATO stops its enlargement. You stop trying to get military bases on our borders. You stop putting weapon systems that can hit us in a few minutes, and we discuss it. And the White House answer was, nothing to discuss. And we're certainly not going to talk about NATO enlargement. And then the invasion came on February 24th, 2022. So if ever there was a series of missed opportunities over 30 years to avoid a conflict, this is it. And that's why I'm deeply unimpressed by an analysis that said this war started on February 24th, 2022 by an unprovoked attack by President Putin. It's just not true. It started because of a buildup of conflict over a 30-year period and lots of cheating, I'm afraid, by the United States side. And that brings us to our mess right now.
So we are, Jeff, where we are right now, and obviously this angle is something that is fiercely opposed by official capital views of the European Union and Washington as well. But the fact of life is that set of very harsh economic sanctions were imposed on the Russian Federation unilaterally by the United States and the European Union. And as both economist and intellectual, what's your take on these sanctions? How effective?
Those are opposites, by the way, economist and intellectual.
Intellectual. Well,
Just to make the point.
try to be both in answering this, but and why do you think that majority of nations don't seem to have been ready to support this course of action, at least not so far?
First, on the sanctions, the United States uses sanctions a lot. It's an interesting policy. They use it a lot because it's without any direct budget outlay, and it can do a lot of damage. And it doesn't require any public debate. It doesn't require any congressional approval. The public doesn't even understand what it is, but who cares? It's not their business. This is purely the president by signing a document. And the U.S. uses these unilateral sanctions. This is different from sanctions approved by the UN. That's a different matter because the Security Council can vote sanctions under the UN Charter. But this is the U.S. using its sanctions, and they do it a lot. The one thing I would observe about this is they almost never work in geopolitical terms. And I've watched for years the use of sanctions by the U.S. as a cheap, easy policy fail time and again. One was the United States, in one of the most ridiculous foreign policy moves you can imagine, suddenly decided under Trump to declare that the president of Venezuela wasn't the president, but the president that the United States said was the president. So the United States one day announced Maduro is not president, Guaido is president. It's in English we would say pretty ballsy. That you just announce one day who the other country's president actually is. It's a strange kind of foreign policy. Anyway, they said, okay, since Maduro's not president, he can't have any access to foreign exchange reserves anymore. He can't Venezuela won't be allowed to fix its oil drilling and so forth. So by stroke of a pen, they put on these unilateral sanctions. It actually worked in one sense. It completely crushed the Venezuelan economy, which declined by more than 50% in GDP, extraordinary decline. What didn't work is Maduro's still there, of course. And Guaido, by the way, was thrown out even by the opposition saying, no, he's not our president anymore. The whole thing was absurd. It was worse than a high school play, actually. Oh, you're not student council president? He is. Yeah, but he won the vote. No, it doesn't matter. But anyway, they did this, but it didn't work geopolitically. It didn't end Maduro's government. In fact, in a way, he said, look, all this economic crisis caused by the gringos in the north, which was pretty accurate description, after all. It was the United States that did this. So now, by the way, the White House sends its emissaries to Maduro. Would you pump more oil? Because we have to replace the Russian oil. So now they're trying to become buddies with Maduro again. But the point is, it didn't work. And no U.S. sanctions regime that I know of in recent years has come close to working. So that's a starting point. So as soon as the U.S. put on sanctions on Russia, I talked to a very senior official and I said, this isn't going to work. It doesn't work. This time it was worse though, because not only did it not cripple the Russian economy, the boomerang effect, which didn't apply in Venezuela so much, because you could crush Venezuela without the whole world feeling it, applied in the case of Russia, which is it's led to tremendous global negative consequences. So it didn't stop Russia from exporting all over the world. And I'll come to your question, why? But it also hurt Europe a lot because Europe's told, no, you can't buy the low-cost energy that your industry has built upon. So the effects were quite serious, and we haven't seen the last of those effects yet. But when the sanctions were imposed, it was the U.S. and always the Anglo-Saxon world, so that's the U.S., Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand. That's a block of the security system of the US. Then the EU, okay? Then Japan, Korea, and Singapore. That's basically it. That's roughly 20% or so of the world population, roughly speaking. Maybe a little bit less, actually. And most of the rest of the world said, we don't want to get into this. We trade with Russia, we trade with Ukraine. We're not party to this conflict. We think this conflict should stop with negotiations. And so most of the world does not want this. Of course, a lot of the world's afraid of the U.S. secondary sanctions, but the vast majority of the world doesn't agree with these sanctions and doesn't even agree with the idea that any country can just decide to impose these sanctions, which are illegal in international law, after all. There's no legal basis for one country to say, stop trading with all those other countries. You can't do that. But they're a little afraid, but they don't impose the sanctions. This is the basic reason why Russian economy has done fine during the past year, because China trades with Russia, India trades with Russia, all the Asian countries trade with Russia, the Latin American countries trade with Russia. Today, Chancellor Scholz has been in South America, and he's being told by the South American leaders, don't pull us into this. We're not going to send arms to Ukraine. They trade with Russia, but they also trade with Ukraine, by the way. They don't want to be in this proxy war. So that's the main reason. And they don't view it like the U.S. thought automatically they would view it, that this is an unprovoked attack. I speak to world leaders all over the world, and they understand full well this is a confrontation of two superpowers, not one side launching a war. And they want both sides to back off.